Who here hasn't seen the Karate Kid films? These films have given kids and adults exciting martial arts stories for years, and even to this day with the addition of Cobra Kai to Netflix, the movie-adapted TV series has become a franchise, with its influence being felt and referenced in countless forms of pop culture throughout the years. Today, let's take a trip down memory lane and talk about the Karate Kid movies in chronological order. At number 7, we have the iconic movie that started it all. Kids these days might think it's a cheesy film full of cliches and genre tropes, but what many people don't realize is that the first Karate Kid movie was the start of a cultural zeitgeist. You know all those tropes people talk about in relation to teen sports movies? They all started here, with Daniel LaRusso's first meeting with Mr. Miyagi. The plot of the movie revolves around young Daniel LaRusso learning to navigate through teenage life in a new city. Plus, he learns to solve his problems by kicking people really hard. That is, of course, with the help of a wise martial artist, Mr. Miyagi. While overall pretty original, it did take some inspiration from movies like Rocky, complete with its very own, now iconic, training montage sequences. Speaking of iconic, the movie is packed with scenes that have been referenced in countless TV shows, movies, and even cartoons. Anyone with a television has probably heard someone say, "wax on, wax off" at some point. Along with that, we've seen the iconic crane kick finisher being replicated, parodied, and mentioned in some other piece of media. The influence of the movie was clearly impactful, considering that it spawned a franchise that is still going strong to this day, with spin-offs, video games, cartoons, action figures, basically anything that a kid could possibly want to get their hands on. Sometimes the first time's the charm. Coming up at number 6, Karate Kid 2 takes us to the other side of the world. If there's one thing the second Karate Kid movie made sure to do, it was to up the scale and tension in every way possible. After all, how else do you expect them to follow up on one of the most universally beloved teen action movies of all time? In this iteration, Daniel and Mr. Miyagi go international, switching the setting of the movie from America to Okinawa, Miyagi's childhood home. Throughout the course of the story, we see a bunch of themes being explored that most action movies at that time wouldn't even look at, let alone action movies that are supposed to be for kids. We see things like the effects of the American occupation of Japan on everyday people and the futility of the cycle of revenge. Pretty heavy stuff for a teen flick. Karate Kid 2 also might be Miyagi's best on-screen representation, as we see him struggle to reconcile with the people that he left behind so many years ago. As a backdrop to all this drama, we have love triangles, sweeping Okinawan storms, and a blood-pumping death battle between Daniel and his romantic rival, Chosen. Unfortunately, fans generally agree that the sequel, while fun, did kind of shunt Daniel off into the background, something that was pretty inevitable given the setting. Many also criticized the last fight for being wholly unnecessary, simply existing so that Daniel would have something to do in the end. Regardless, the movie still ends up in the pantheon of classic sequels. For our 5th entry, we have the movie with the most insane villain in the franchise. The 3rd entry of the Karate Kid franchise did one thing that set itself apart from anything that came before or after, and that's through the introduction of the villainous Terry Silver. Previously, villains like Kreese and Chosen were only slightly dramatically entertaining, maybe even in a cheesy sort of way, but Silver takes the insane villain Cake and slams his own head into it. The movie gained a cult following almost purely based on his performance as the manipulative mastermind set to team up with Kreese in order to try and ruin Daniel's life and will to fight. Karate Kid 3 also marks the last time many would see Ralph Macchio's Daniel for many years, right up until Cobra Kai. Regardless, it was a pretty solid farewell, especially considering that the movie has the single best Miyagi fight. Cruising into the 4th spot, let's look at the animation everyone forgot. Making Saturday morning cartoons out of beloved movies was pretty common practice back in the late 80s and early 90s, and the Karate Kid franchise was no exception to the rule. It released its very own cartoon in 1989. Unfortunately, there's not much to say about it. Most of us would honestly be pretty hard-pressed to remember it even existed. The plot follows Daniel and Mr. Miyagi trying to retrieve a sacred artifact and traveling across the world in the process. The animation and music were alright, but fans of the movie had almost nothing to return to, with the cartoon having very little connection to the rest of the franchise. Keeping that in mind, it's not surprising that the show was cancelled after only 13 episodes. Bummer too, it had a pretty banger theme song. Up next at number 3, we have the only female-led Karate Kid movie to To say that The Next Karate Kid was controversial when it came out would be the understatement of the year. Fans everywhere were outraged when they discovered that the fourth installment would not contain Daniel, but instead have the titular Karate Kid be Hilary Swank's Julie. Mr. Miyagi, thankfully, was still very much in it. Now, we're not saying that the movie doesn't have its merits. Considering that it was her film debut, Hilary Swank knocked it out of the park, bringing to her role the signature charm and flair that highlighted the future of her career. Miyagi, of course, shines, as always, as the wise mentor helping out a struggling teen trying to find their place in the world. Unfortunately, the rest of the movie doesn't match up to the talent of its leads. Not only is the action stiff and unimpressive, but the plot feels like a retread of concepts we've seen before in the previous movies, rather than bringing anything fresh to the table. On top of that, the villains leave much to be desired, coming nowhere near to the flair and dramatic, almost self-parodying gravitas of Kreese or Terry Silver. For many, this movie was a sign that the beloved series might just be dead in the water. For our second entry, Jaden Smith takes a crack at becoming the next Karate Kid. The late 2000s and early 2010s saw Hollywood flood itself with sequels and remakes of films that many people believe defined their childhood. The Karate Kid was no exception to the reboot training. In 2010, audiences were treated to a brand new Karate Kid, one that not only introduced a new cast of characters, but a whole new setting and form of karate. A little side note, it also had Jaden Smith and Jackie Chan, two celebrities that you just might have heard of. The reboot follows a story of Smith's Dre Parker, who's forced to move to China with his mother and immediately experiences harsh bullying from a fellow student who knows Kung Fu. Just like the original, he goes on to find strength and purpose through the teachings of his wise mentor Jackie Chan's Mr. Han, in order to ultimately defeat the bully and win over his love interest. Now, the plot here could hardly be called original, but it was far from the realm of bad. The fight scenes are solidly choreographed. The villains are menacing and convincing, and Chan's performance as a mentor figure was both nostalgic and showed the aged actor's depth and range. However, the movie was bogged down by the fact that Jaden acts as if he'd rather be anywhere else at any given point. Beyond that, people weren't too interested in a reboot and were clamoring instead for the formula and characters they loved, a wish that would soon be granted in our next entry. Finally, at number 1, we have the show that brought the Karate Kid to the modern world. When Netflix announced the return of Karate Kid to this new day and age, fans were instantly confused at the name of the show, Cobra Kai. After all, weren't they the villains of the very first outing? The reason that Daniel started learning karate in the first place? Well, in a twist that ended up elevating the show beyond anyone's expectations, the lead ended up being William Zabka's Johnny Lawrence, Daniel's first ever rival. Through his eyes, audience, new and old, are able to see the world that these characters inhabit in a brand new light, showing the story of a man struggling to put his life back into order after his high school mistakes. Throughout the show, we not only see an entire troupe of recurring characters such as Machio's Daniel, Chosen, Kreese, and even Terry Silver, but we also experience the journey of a whole new generation of teenagers using karate to further their personal growth. Well, folks, that's all the Karate Kid related news we have for you today. Which movie is your favorite? Do you remember which one was your first? If you enjoyed our content, make sure to like, subscribe, and smash that bell icon. See you all next time.